So this one is like honey. I blew up the meshlicious. Sup. Welcome to Machines and More. All right, so this should be the last one before our Computex content starts. By the time you see this, I will be on my way over to Taipei again, so I will see you all from there soon. But I did want to give you a peek at this new case, a quick review here. From Lian Li last week, we did see the 26-liter Dan A3 mini-itx. This one is the SUP or SUP01. It's also from Lian Li, but much bigger, almost twice the volume here at 46 liters. And we saw this one at Lian Li's Computex event almost exactly a year ago. And from my notes, this was supposed to be a mid-October launch last year, but here we are, and that's just how things go sometimes in the industry. Real quick before we begin, big thanks to Lian Li. They provided the case to the channel for the purposes of evaluation and review at no cost to us, but I am not paid by them for this content. They don't have any say over the testing methodology or how I build it up, and they won't be seeing the content ahead of time. They're going to be seeing the review findings and the results at the same time you do. Quick highlights: 46 liters, mini-itx up to ATX boards, ATX power supply up to 220 millimeters. Chamber is at the bottom. It does in fact have cutouts on the motherboard panel for back connect motherboard, so your BTF or Project Zero type of setup will work fine if you're thinking of going to that route or doing that in the future. All the panels that you can take off, save for the radiator bracket, those are all toolless. Comes with 3 fans pre-installed and a tempered glass panel. Also a mirrors section here underneath the motherboard. This does have an RGB surround on the front and side of the case here. Also on the riser cable, they're all synced up, and you can toggle the RGB with buttons on the side panel I/O. Drive cage under the main chamber can support 2 2.5-inch SSDs or 2 3.5-inch HDDs. Another 2 2.5-inch SSDs can go under the board area right here. Standout feature here is the stand-up GPU, which is the case's namesake. Much like the meshlicious, your graphics card will stand vertically, although this one is going to be at the front versus the side, and that's going to be connected via an included PCIe 4.0 riser cable. That's screwed into the case right here pretty securely. And that's with the I/O facing downwards for the GPU. GPU is going to ride on a bracket that supports up to a 380 millimeter long card that is capable of being lowered for an additional 20 millimeters of length. So max 400 millimeter long cards, 4 slots, which that'll be plenty for most cards on the market today. 4 slots, 400 millimeters. I think you're covered here. The width is really not an issue. There's so much space there. So the airflow concept here is evident when looking down into the case. The case is basically subdivided into a few chambers, much like an SFF sandwich style case is. That is, you have your motherboard on one half here, the radiator is on the other half, up to 360 or 280, and you pretty much should use an AIO here because there's only 88 millimeters of clearance here. Yeah, you can fit some small top-down air coolers, but there's a glass panel right over it, right? So it would be a rather strange choice to do air cooling here, given you have way more space for an AIO, and even if you didn't need a 360, you could still do a 240. 3 included case fans immediately adjacent to the rad are pre-mounted as an exhaust, and at the front you have a chamber for the GPU. I didn't do it because I don't like how it looks, but you can attach a 120 millimeter fan externally underneath this grill at the back of the case. It'll protrude out the back, and you will route the cable through the hole where the RGBs, the riser card's RGB cable also runs. The main purpose of that fan would be for some board cooling, because otherwise you don't have too much airflow there. The case is not extremely difficult to build in, although I wouldn't call it easy either. My impression after building it is the cable management process. It's a little bit more complicated just because of how things are compartmentalized in here, the unique layout, and I found that it makes sense to run the cables first. Just at least give yourself an idea how you want things to run. You don't have to put the power supply in just yet, but then you could if you wanted to. So I just went ahead and put in the power supply in the bottom chamber. Here I was using Be Quiet's Dark Power Pro 1300 watt supply. Total overkill for this setup, but hey, why not, right? After kind of roughing in the cables, I put the motherboard in place and connected those cables. Here I have the Gigabyte Aura's Elite B650 mini-itx board, used in the last 2 reviews, here with the 7900X. But you do want to do the board at this point because you're going to need to be able to access and route cables behind the motherboard. You can't do that if the radiator is there, so do that now. For side panel, or I guess front and side panel I/O, you have 2 USB-A, 1 USB-C HD audio, power and reset button, which is cleverly concealed as part of the Lian Li logo. So you'll want to connect up those cables, and it's not until all that is done that you'll want to run the AIO. So we'll discuss intake versus exhaust at the AIO just in a little bit. But installing the radiator in the block, it is a little bit tricky because you'll remove the top part that secures the radiator section, and then you'll tilt out the radiator bracket. It sits on a pair of rubber feet, so you can just pull that out and then tilt it back in. But the tricky part is really running the tubing to the motherboard. And here, the unit I'm using is Lian Li's GA2 Trinity Performance, which has articulating 45-degree elbows, which is a very unique feature of these AIOs. And I wouldn't be surprised if the case were designed with that in mind, since it seems to me that that design allows the tubes to loop around gently. And that's very elegant, and you just loop up the excess tubing here at the CPU block. So I definitely recommend a unit like this if possible, although that is kind of a limitation of the case as well. The exhaust fans next to the radiator are pre-mounted, so you just have to hook those up. Riser cable can be installed at the motherboard at any point. That'll just slot in, and then you screw it down to the case. Needs to be securely connected to the expansion brackets, which these expansion brackets are pared down because the assumption is that with the card at the front, you'll only have smaller expansion cards here. Since it kind of lives in its own world, now you can realistically do the card at any point, but it just happens to be the last item I did. Installing the card is a little bit tricky, so one way to do it is to mount the bracket to the card first. The bracket has 4 slots of thickness available, so you can kind of pick and choose for most people that don't have 4-slot cards. Now, Lian Li recommends installing the card in the frontmost position, which I will discuss when we get to thermals shortly, but I think if you're using a 3-slot or less card, you're going to want to push it back 1 slot. At this point, you may want to run the display cable, since with the I/O facing down, it is very tight, and it's easier to run the cable right now. That'll come through the bottom chamber through the rubber gasket at the back. And then you place the card down on the platform, attach the other end of the riser cable. With my card, which is not as tall, in order to reach the bracket, I did have to invert the bracket to get it to sit low enough to touch. But even then, the retention bracket didn't sit nicely on it. So I think that's a possible refinement for Lian Li to consider right there. But it is a little bit shaky. So you can center the card if you like, and then just make sure the power cables are hooked up. And then just close everything back up because your build's done. All right, let's talk thermals. Lian Li's recommendation is to install the radiator fans as intake. And that might seem kind of odd because if you did it that way, it would seem that the exhaust has to do a 180, right? It has to come in and then exit out through the exhaust fans. Confused airflow doesn't work well oftentimes. I'm kind of skeptical. So I tested it with the Ryzen 9 7900X locked at 5.4 gigahertz at 1.25 volts for a CPU-only scenario. It didn't seem to make too much of a difference. Intake with the exhaust having to do that 180 loop does actually seem a little bit worse though. So compared to a more standard mid-tower like the TD500 Max with its custom 360 running at only 1250 RPM, which is a little bit quieter than this unit. The performance here with the sandwiched AIO, it does lag a little bit. And even the A3 mini-itx has better performance. So one thing to consider. Still, I don't think the CPU rendering capability is the main draw of this case. Combined use such as gaming will be the main focus, I believe. For 1440p gaming tests, I did want to touch on the GPU's position first before I talk about intake versus exhaust on the RAD. So I mentioned earlier, Lian Li recommended to push the card forward as much as possible. So I did start out that way, and the temps were not as good as I had hoped because I could tell something was not optimal. There was a turbulent noise, like the airflow was getting cut off. So what I did was I just checked the thermals and then I shifted it in and reran, and that actually gave much better thermals and lower noise. So as for radiator intake or exhaust, the intake orientation of the CPU's cooler does actually result in better CPU thermals here. And if you are gaming with your system, I do not recommend it. I'd rather have a graphics card running almost 6 degrees cooler and take that small penalty of 2.5 degrees warmer on the CPU, since it really will not change things too much for the CPU performance, but for the card, it will have a noticeable impact, and probably more so for noise, since these fans can then run at a lower RPM. And since the card is all the way at the front where it might be closer to the user, that noise, it's going to be a lot more prominent otherwise due to just that proximity. Here the thermals are fine overall, with some very good GPU temps that are possible, but I think you need to experiment to see what works best for your card and your setup. Most users may want to set up rad fans as exhaust with this case and shift the card in one slot. So MSRP here, $150, black or white. The build quality is good. I didn't have any issues with the toolless panels. It should be able to handle any components that you want to throw at it. But I do have to put this one in the recommend with caution category. So on the plus side, the quality is very good. The design is unconventional and it looks intriguing, right? Conversation started for sure with the GPU in the front. The external lighting may be polarizing. Some of you might consider that gamery. You may not want to turn it on. That's okay too. At least it's nice that you can control the lighting from the outside as well. And many will like how this looks. It's always neat to see something different and out of the box. Cooling performance here is adequate. And that being said, other than being different, I am not convinced that it necessarily does that much more than your typical mid-tower. It's not that much smaller either. So figure the TD500 comes in at 50 liters. You are mandated to dealing with a riser cable here, and you give up air cooling being a competent option or competent alternative to the liquid cooling capability. On top of that, I did find the vertical GPU a little bit finicky to build, and having to pre-route the display cable I find the first time, but figure every time that you want to unplug or side panel has to come off, GPU might even have to come out. Also, then the display cable becomes a permanent fixture, more or semi-permanent fixture, and that might get annoying, and I can see this absolutely driving some people nuts. The RAD can be a bit tricky to install, plus you have to be cautious what type of unit you use. And my impression is Lian Li's own AIO units will work best because of the way the tubing has to wrap around. So just be aware of that if you already have an AIO. Because this one is so different though, the build process and cabling, it's a little bit more involved. So I really would not recommend this to first-time builders unless you have some experienced help. But if you're fine with those caveats, I think you will be very happy with this case. All right, so that'll do it for this review. Hope you enjoyed it and found it helpful. So please give a like. Please make sure you are subscribed. I'll leave the component links and the case links down below when available. And I'll see you on the road to Computex.